Today I will talk about some photography basics. So what is the shutter speed, aperture and ISO? So let's start. Hey guys, it's Nemanja and welcome to another fun episode. Today I will teach you what is the exposure, how to get a proper exposure, what is the shutter speed, aperture, ISO. All the photography basics. And this is my first photography oriented tutorial and there will be more in the future. But don't worry, I will still continue making those Photoshop tutorials on a regular basis. This is just another addition to my channel. Okay, now that we covered that, let's talk about what is the photography. Photography is basically painting with the light, and light is the most important thing in photography, obviously. So the image is made inside the camera with that light. Light is basically painting the image on the image sensor or on the film on analog cameras. So exposure, now we can talk about the exposure. Exposure is the amount of light that reaches to the camera sensor or a film. And the exposure is controlled by three separate things. That's shutter speed, aperture and ISO. And exposure basically determines how the image is bright or dark. So what is the shutter speed? It's the speed of camera's shutter, and the shutter is a mechanical part that is moving up and down and is positioned in the front of camera sensor or a film. So the shutter speed determines the amount of the time that the camera sensor is exposed to the light. As you can see, this is a shutter right here, and that's something like a curtain in your window that you can open and close. And as I already said, the shutter determines the amount of the time that the light reaches to your camera sensor. And now if I press the shutter button right here, you can see the shutter opened and closed in a matter of part of the second. So shutter speed is measured in seconds. It can be a few seconds long or just part of the second, like 1/100th of the second or 1/1000 or 2000 of the second, etc. And the shutter speed affects the image brightness and image sharpness. So if your shutter speed is really high, like just part of the second, for example 1/500th of a second, that's 0.002 seconds. That's really short amount of time. And if you're taking a photo of a moving subject, like moving camera for example, you will let the light to paint on that sensor only for that small window of time of 0.002 seconds. That's basically, if this camera is moving, like you will just capture a moment in time and your camera will look like it's frozen there, it's standing still in time. And your camera will be really sharp and clear. But if your shutter speed is low, like 1 second or half of the second, doesn't matter, or 3 seconds, then you will let the light to paint the sensor for all that second or 3 seconds, etc. And you will capture all that movement, and that's why your subject will be blurry. So remember that. Okay, the next thing that we need to talk about is an aperture. Aperture is something like a ring that can be bigger or smaller, and it's positioned inside the camera lens. And aperture controls the amount of the light that is coming to the sensor. Okay, let's take this lens off the camera and let me explain you what the aperture is practically. If you look through this lens, you can see the ring that is getting smaller and smaller, and this is the aperture ring. So it can be really wide open like this or really closed down like this. And aperture is measured in f-stops. So for now you need just to remember that the aperture is measured in that f-stops. And the higher number is, the smaller hole is, the smaller that ring is. So if the aperture is, for example, 1.4, that means that it's really wide open and a lot of light will come through that lens. If the aperture is, example, f22, that means that is really tiny hole and really small, just small amount of light will come through that lens for the same amount of time. The aperture will affect, like a shutter speed, the brightness of the image. So that means that if the aperture is wide open, your image will be brighter, or if the aperture is closed down, your image will be darker. And one more thing that aperture will affect is depth of field. So what is the depth of field? Depth of field is basically sharpness of an image in that 3D space, in an image depth. So for example, you're shooting a model and model is nice, sharp, in a focus, and everything behind the model is blurry, out of the focus. So that means that the model inside that depth of field, and the depth of field is really shallow, so it's short. And depth of field can be really wide or really narrow, depends of an aperture value. So aperture will control that. So if the aperture is widely open, you will have shallow depth of field. If the aperture is closed down, like really small f22, you will have everything inside the focus. So depth of field will be really big. Okay, we just covered the aperture basics. Now let's talk about the ISO. ISO is basically a sensitivity of camera sensor. So the higher ISO number is, the more brighter image will be for the same amount of aperture and shutter speed values. But for the higher ISO number, you will get more noisy image. So that's something that you don't like. If you have really low ISO value, like the lowest that your camera can give you, you will have really nice and clear images without noise. But if you crank that ISO more and more up, you will introduce more and more noise into your image. But then maybe you can ask yourself, why would I ever put that high ISO number if that produces more noise to my image? Well, because sometimes you're in some really low light situation, but you want to capture something and there is no enough light to make a proper exposure to your image, and you need to make your sensor more sensitive to that light. So that means that less amount of light, less intensity of light actually needs to expose your sensor for that proper exposure. So sometimes you need to make some compromises. If you want to get some image, you need to introduce a little bit of the noise in it. Okay, now that we covered three things that controls the exposure: shutter speed, aperture and ISO, let me show you how those three things works together to create a proper exposed image. This is one of the two websites that I want to show you today, where you can see how those three things, shutter speed, aperture and ISO, works together to create a proper exposed image, and how they affect each other with depth of field, image sharpness and image noise. So here you can see we have aperture slider, we have shutter speed slider, and we have ISO slider. So right here we have exposure meter. And exposure meter is something that all modern cameras have. Exposure meter will tell you if the image is properly exposed, or if it's darker underexposed, or if it's brighter overexposed. So you basically want to have this pointer set on 0 to make sure that your image will be correctly exposed. Okay, with the aperture, we controlled the amount of the light that's coming to the sensor, and we control the depth of field. If you remember, if the f value is higher, like f16 or f22, that means that that ring is really small and the depth of field will be really big, so everything will basically be in the focus. So let's experiment with that. As you can see here, we have an airplane, and airplane now it's in focus and the background and foreground is out of focus. And if we want to have everything in focus, we need to put the aperture, let's go crazy all the way to f22. Let's exaggerate a little bit. Now with f22 everything will be for sure in focus. But now if this is f22, we have really small whole tiny ring where the light is coming, and that means that really just a small amount of light will come to the image sensor. And as you can see, the image is really underexposed, and the exposure meter says very underexposed. So that means that we need to control the shutter speed and ISO. So first let's put the ISO all the way down to the lowest value to make sure that we have as less noise in the image that we can. So if we put it all the way down, that means that we are still underexposed, and now we are even more underexposed, because the lower ISO value, the darker image will be. Now let's play with the shutter speed. That's the only thing that left for us to play if we want to have no noisy image and everything in focus. So let's see. If we move the shutter speed all the way to the left, we will have properly exposed image, but that means that now our shutter speed is 1 second. That means that we need to have our camera on the tripod, otherwise if we hold 1 second camera in our hands, camera will be a little bit shaky and whole image will be blurry. But now on this example, camera is on a tripod, and what is moving is the propeller of the plane. So you will see that propeller will be blurry still, but everything else will be in focus. Let's take a photo. And as you can see, exactly what I said, this is our result, and the propeller is completely blurry, you cannot see it even, and everything else is in focus. Background is in focus, foreground is in focus, and image is properly exposed. So let's cancel this, And now let's try to freeze the propeller. So if you remember, the shutter speed controls the image sharpness, so that everything will be freeze inside the image. So if we want to freeze the propeller, we need to crank up the shutter speed. So we need to have really just a tiny portion of a second shutter open to let the light in, because we want to freeze the moment in time. So let's put it let's go all the way 1/4000 just for fun. So that means that we need to boost the ISO all the way up, but we still don't have a properly exposed image. We need to open the aperture. We need to let more light in for the same amount of time. So let's open the aperture a little bit like this and let's take a photo. And this is it. Because our ISO is really high, you can see a lot of noise in the image, but our propeller is sharp, is freezed in time, and background and foreground are a little bit blurry because we opened the aperture a little bit and then we introduced smaller depth of field. So let's go and close this and let's get rid of the noise. So let's put the noise all the way down, but that means that we need to open the aperture a little bit, and let's play with the shutter speed. Let me see, this will not freeze the propeller, but this will freeze the propeller, and a little bit of noise still, let me see. And this is the result. We have a less noise, we freeze the propeller, and we have a lot of we have a shallow depth of field, a lot of blurry part because we open the aperture completely wide. Alright guys, that was the first website where you can go and practice how those three settings affects exposure and each other, and depth of field, sharpness and noise. And now I'll show you another one, and both websites links you have down there in the description. Alright guys, this is the second website, and this one is really handy because you can see the changes in real time. So if you put from a shutter priority to manual right here, you can see how the shutter speed, aperture and ISO affects the image brightness, for example. So if you crank the shutter speed, if you boost the shutter speed, you'll have darker image. If you boost the aperture, you'll have darker image. But if you boost the ISO, you will have much brighter image with a lot of noise in it. And of course, you always want to have as less noise as you can in the image. So sometimes you need to play with the settings. You want a wider aperture with really low ISO, so you will have really crystal clear, no noise image, etc. And that's why the photography is really fun. That's why we have such big variety of different lenses. Some lenses are really good for low light situations, some are really good for portraits, some for landscapes, etc. But for now you don't need to worry about that at all. Only thing that you need to do is to master those three things: shutter speed, aperture and ISO. So you need to master a proper exposure. And when you master that, you will be much better photographer. So you can go to those websites, you can have the link down there in the description, and practice with the software. Or even better, you can grab your cameras, go outside and practice with that. It doesn't matter if you don't have a lens that can go really wide open like f1.4. Maybe you have a lens that can go f5.6 to f16 or f22. Doesn't matter, play with that, experiment. You will see how those settings affects each other and master that. Alright guys, and that would be it for today. I really hope that you liked this episode and that you learned something new about photography basics. If you have any questions regarding to this episode, please leave them down there in the comments below. I will be happy to answer them. So if you appreciate this content, press that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. Have fun, experiment, and see you in next fun episode. Bye bye.